Well, certainly the latest monthly numbers for June, as you mentioned, have been the lowest since August 2020. So certainly the number of transactions towards the bottom end of that series. But it's worth remembering the monthly numbers are quite volatile and they're often revised up as we get new information. So these are very much provisional estimates. We tend to focus more on the quarterly M&A numbers, which feed into the quarterly foreign direct investment and balance of payments numbers. And for those, we did see a fall in the second quarter. For inward M&A, that came down from 5.6 to 5 billion. And for outward mergers and acquisitions, that fell from 4.6 to 4.2, but still within the kind of normal range. I think what's distinct in the last couple of years versus kind of pre-pandemic is in recent years, we haven't seen those really big M&As that we have seen on occasion in the past.
Is a low environment set to change this at all? Because that's what it feels like. You could have access to greater financing, credit cycles as well. You could get greater demand as well, because that ultimately means growth hopefully is happening in economies as well, which means that you anticipate growth among a lot more entities. Is that the case you're anticipating?
Well, certainly we've seen strong economic growth in the UK in the first half of this year, stronger than most people had been expecting. And of course, we're now also starting to see interest rates falling. So you would expect that may be suggesting a more conducive environment to foreign investment, mergers and acquisitions, assuming, of course, that growth pulse continues. Although I know there's a lot of talk in the markets that UK stocks look relatively cheap, UK companies look relatively cheap, particularly compared with, say, North America. And there have been a number of recent acquisitions by US firms of UK firms. We're not really seeing that start to move the dial on the aggregate numbers yet. But of course, if that trend continues, that may be what we see in future quarters.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to talk about that. Foreign companies acquiring UK companies in the second quarter, then that was 5 billion, lower than the 5.6 billion then recorded in the previous quarter. If it's a concern about liquidity, one would definitely say elements like moving or being taken up by a company stateside would certainly aid that a lot. Are you finding that there's concerns around liquidity in the UK market as opposed to generally other markets like the US?
Well, financial liquidity is not something you look at directly. Certainly what we are continuing to see is the US is the major source of inward mergers and acquisitions, and that's been true for quite some time. So last year, the US spent 19 billion acquiring UK companies, significantly higher than any other country, or indeed higher than the EU as well. Interestingly, though, in terms of outward mergers and acquisitions, the EU has attracted more investment from UK companies than the US. So it's not all one-way, two-way flows.
Yeah, actually, that's a very interesting part of that to actually note. In terms of sectors, then, just to look at, I mean, we've just spoken about the Right Move deal having been announced yesterday. Even Hargreaves Lansdown in that property sector. Is that the sector that looks ripe for a lot of these? Is that what the data is showing you? Or are there other sectors that are seeing a lot more movement?
I'd say on a monthly, even on a quarterly basis, the sectors move around quite a bit. I don't think you can really generalize that much from a relatively short span of data observations. In terms of longer term trends, look, I think people will be familiar with, the attractions of small pharma companies, small tech companies, fintech, etc. And I guess what's interesting is there's been a few instances more recently of potential interest in medium-sized listed companies rather than just kind of small ones. But like I said, whether that impacts the aggregate numbers will depend on whether those trends continue in the second half of the year.
Sure.